Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my post NAIC tier list. The North American International Championships most recently wrapped up, and the format has been shaken up quite a bit. Next month, we have League Cups and League Challenges as well for the 2024-2025 season, which will also be starting, so it's important to keep up to date with what is happening in the competitive Pokemon TCG. But with that being said, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's hop right into it. So starting off here, we're going to go first off over one of the decks that definitely surprised a lot of people. We saw it place in top 16. I believe Jacob I placed 14th with the deck, and that is going to be Regidrago. Regidrago is a deck that definitely caught some people off guard heading into the tournament. We did see in some online events this deck's seen some success, and I kind of wrote it off. However, when I actually sat down and played the deck a little bit more over this past week, I was actually pretty impressed. I think this deck has a lot of potential. I think heading into Worlds, it gets a little bit stronger, gains things like the Kyurem from the brand new set. So I think this deck is pretty decent as of right now. I think it has potential maybe to move up to A, kind of depending on the format. It takes actually a decent Gardevoir matchup, and its Lost Zone matchup as well is relatively solid because you have that Dragapult, which means on that second turn of the game, you can use the Phantom Dive and pretty much just wipe your opponent's board in 3 or 4 attacks, which is really, really difficult for Lost Zone to deal with. So Lost Zone has a much better chance against just the regular Dragapult variant because that's a stage 2 deck. It needs a lot of setup, and you can just kind of run them over with things like maybe turn 1 or turn 2 Radiant Greninja, turn 2 Sableye. A lot of those things can just kind of overwhelm the Dragapult deck, and Lost Zone can steal games versus that. However, versus Regidrago, you're pretty much playing a Dragapult deck, but those problems don't exist. So I think that Regidrago actually does pretty good against Lost Box, which we just saw win the North American International Championships. So interesting for sure. I think this deck has some potential. It can be a little bit clunky at times. That's one of the problems it sometimes runs into, but it's a pretty cool deck. Next up here, we got Gardevoir. I think Gardevoir is the only S tier deck right now. 6 out of the top 8. I actually got top 32 with the deck at NAIC, and the deck just dominated the tournament. It didn't win, however, it just dominated it so much. 6 out of the top 8 at the biggest tournament of the year is just ridiculous. Its matchup spread is incredible. It can beat pretty much anything. In my opinion, actually takes a pretty decent Lost Zone toolbox matchup, especially if you play things like the Klefki. Double Dark Energy, Double Monkey Dory is also really good in that matchup as well. So I think Gardevoir is probably the only S tier deck. Incredibly dominant right now and very, very solid. Next up here, we got Lost Zone Toolbox. Lost Zone Toolbox won the North American International Championships. Andrew Hedrick was able to take that down. Andy Gantner as well got top 8 with this deck. So deck saw plenty of success. Lots in top 32, 64, 128, plenty of Lost Box we saw there. It's good. It's a great deck. Very consistent. Definitely one of the more consistent decks in the format, especially in a format where everything feels so setup based. I mean, you got decks like Gardevoir, Dragapult, you got things like Chen Pao, like all the Charizard variants. There's so many setup based decks, and Lost Zone specialty is dealing with those setup based decks. So Lost Zone is really, really good right now, has a lot of skill expression as well, but can be pretty difficult to play. So it's very good. I don't think it's an S tier deck, but incredibly powerful. Definitely deserves its spot near the top of the tier list. Next up here, we got Raging Bolt. I think Raging Bolt is a C tier deck now after seeing the metagame kind of shake up. I think its matchup spread is relatively mediocre against some of the top decks. Its Lost Zone matchup isn't great. Its Gardevoir matchup is also pretty tough as well, which makes it hard to justify playing moving forward. However, what it does have is great consistency. That is one thing that it gains. So I actually, the more I think about it, I'm actually going to move this deck up to B. I don't think it's bad. I just think its matchup versus Gardevoir and Lost Zone Toolbox can be pretty rough. You can play Vacuum, which does make the matchup definitely a little bit better, but it does pretty much set up every single game, and there's a lot of value to that. So I would not be surprised to see this deck actually see success. It just has some problems against some of the top decks that I'm still trying to figure out, which makes me a little bit apprehensive to play it, but it's still very solid. Next up here, we got Lugia. Lugia, I think it's a B tier deck. I think that it's probably better than Regidrago and Raging Bolt. Its matchup against Gardevoir is not great. Its Lost Zone matchup as well isn't spectacular. However, it is kind of that ultimate glass cannon deck. When it does set up, it has all the tools it needs to beat pretty much everything in the format. So it has that going for it. You can potentially play heavier counts of Jamming Tower to try and compensate for the Gardevoir matchup and do a little bit better against that, but admittedly, it still is quite tough for sure. It's a good deck, though. It struggles a lot with consistency, which is the biggest thing holding it back. If the deck set up every single game, it would probably be an S tier deck and would be dominating, but it underperformed quite a bit at NAIC. Didn't see a ton of success there. I think the highest was a top 16 or 32, as we know that none actually made it into top 8. So it's a decent deck, though, for sure. Next up, we got Charizard. Charizard's an A tier deck, I think, as of right now. I think with Gardevoir seeing success, it gets significantly better. You can play Jirachi, and your matchup against Lost Zone Toolbox is also quite good. I think that Charizard was pretty underappreciated heading into the North American International Championships because people were hyping up things like Dragapult, and Dragapult does pretty good against that because of things like the TMD evolution. However, we saw a lot of Dragapult lists and even end up playing the TM Devo, and Dragapult didn't see a whole lot of success, which was kind of the big reason why Charizard, people were kind of straying away from playing it, but they did actually see some success. There were some in top 32. There might have been 1 in 16. I could be wrong, but the deck has been seeing some more success, and I really expected to see a lot of success heading into the World Championships, especially at League Cups and League Challenges. I think it makes a really solid play because of its decent matchups versus decks like Gardevoir and Lost Zone Toolbox. You can play Jirachi for the Lost Zone Toolbox matchup, and you can play things like Lost Vacuum and maybe Jamming Tower to help out versus the Gardevoir matchup. Really good deck actually right now. I think it's very underappreciated. I think people are going to quickly start to realize that this deck is still incredibly strong. Next up here, we got Chen Pao. Chen Pao is still a solid deck, definitely top of tier B, still very, very respectable. We saw it see some success, and I think it's decent. I think it takes an okay Gardevoir matchup, okay Lost Zone, takes a good Charizard matchup as well, has a lot of decent matchups. It still kind of is that, ultimate glass cannon deck, especially if decks like Dragapult aren't seeing as much play. I think that Chen Pao has a lot of potential to do well, even though I don't even think the Dragapult matchup is that bad. Chen Pao is solid, definitely respect it, and I definitely think it's going to continue its rise back into potentially tier A eventually. Next up here, we got Greninja. Greninja is probably a tier C or D deck. It's just not the time for it as of right now. I don't necessarily think it does anything significantly better than the other top decks. It can kind of just get ran over by decks. Doesn't have a great damage output as well. I think it's just kind of average as of right now, but maybe in the future it gains some new cards that help it out, but as of right now we're going to put it in tier D. Next up we got Miraidon. Miraidon did see some success at NAIC, has been doing okay in online events. I think it's decent. I think it's a pretty okay deck. Just kind of run your opponent over turn 1 hands is pretty good. You can do a lot of pretty cool plays with things like Iron Hands. You have options to Raichu. You can potentially slow things down by just attacking with things like the Miraidon. It's pretty good. I think that you have the ability to go super fast or play a little bit more conservatively, which is nice. It's good. It's a solid deck. Not really much else to say on it. Definitely think that it's going to see maybe a little bit more play because its Gardevoir matchup is decent. But the problem is that if Charizard continues to rise in popularity, which I expect it to do, that's a huge issue because Miraidon does not do well against Charizard. So we'll have to wait and see. Iron Thorns, if you hit a bunch of right matchups, your deck is pretty good. However, if anyone techs against you or you hit the wrong matchups, your deck is a theme deck, basically. So it's a very risky deck to play. We saw Ross Cawthon see some success with it at NAIC, but we didn't necessarily see any go farther than 64 or 128. It's a fun deck. If you hit the right matchups, it's pretty good. However, it's just way too much matchup roulette, unfortunately. But it's a funny deck, though, for sure. And you will definitely have some fun games with it. Dragapult Charizard, similar to the deck that Tord played. I think it's just worse Charizard Pidgeot. I think Charizard Pidgeot is probably just better. It's a tier B deck. It's okay. Nothing special. Having the thin line of Dragapult is cool, but I don't think necessarily swings a whole lot of matchups that you'd already be losing. If you're trying to beat Lost Zone Toolbox with Charizard, you might as well just play Jirachi. If you're trying to beat things like the Gardevoir, you can just play Vacuum and Jamming Tower and you should be fine. Dragapult Lost Box, I think, is a C tier deck. I think that Dragapult Charizard is, in my opinion, just better. I think Dragapult, just as itself right now, is not the strongest of decks currently. I think that just regular Lost Zone is just a better Lost Zone variant. So, yeah. All right. Next up here, we have Snorlax. I think Snorlax is pretty good. I think Snorlax is actually quite solid. Has a really good Charizard matchup. Its Gardevoir matchup is kind of tough, especially if they play double Turo, but it does really good against the Lost Box as well. Has good matchups against Chen Pao, Raging Bolt, as well as pretty good. The Dragapult matchups are decent too. If Lugia loses popularity because of how popular Gardevoir and Lost Box is, then potentially Snorlax becomes even better. So I'm going to put Snorlax near the top of tier B. I think it's quite decent actually as of right now. And Pidgeot as well, decent deck. I think that Stall might just be a little bit better, as I think Stall has a little bit better of a Lost Zone toolbox and Gardevoir matchup. So Pidgeot I think is decent. I haven't put a whole lot of time into it admittedly in this format, but I still think it's quite solid. Anyways, that is going to do it today for my tier list. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. Let me know if there's any decks that you thought that I missed that I should have mentioned as well. Let me know. But anyways, thanks for all the support as always. I appreciate it. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out, everyone.